You find me this week with a bizarre collection of items laid out on my table for our consideration. To begin with, there's a saddle and harness, then there's a rubber motorcar tire, some pineapples, coconuts and other fruit, coffee beans, nutmeg and an assortment of spices. It's hard to believe nowadays, but at one time this was a large part of what Singapore was all about. Of course, Singapore's principal raison d'etre was always that of a trading post, a free port situated strategically across the major maritime trade routes of Southeast Asia. But there was also the idea in the 19th century that the island could become a successful producer of commercial crops of one description or another. So let's take a look at this curious assortment of things, beginning with the leather saddle and harness.
The only saddles and harnesses you'll find around these days would be at the Turf Club or, of course, the Singapore Polo Club. However, back in the settlement's early years, leather for these and other items was a commodity much in demand, which brings us to why the Gambia plant was one of our first local cash crops.
It was an important part in the process of tanning and dyeing leather. And in an age when the usual mode of transport was horse-borne or horse-drawn, leather production was big business.
When Stamford Raffles arrived in 1819, a Chinese Gambia planter already occupied the western slopes of what was to become known as Mount Sophia. Profitably growing and processing his product, his was the first of many Gambia plantations to come. Pepper was generally grown in conjunction with Gambia, because once the Gambia leaves had been boiled to extract their resin, they served as an efficient fertilizer for the cultivation of pepper. The two crops were thus mutually complementary, but growing Gambia had a downside.
The leaves had to be boiled immediately they were picked. This meant that there had to be large quantities of on-the-spot firewood, and vast swathes of forest were cut down to provide fuel. At the same time, the hungry Gambia plants sucked up all the nutrients from the soil. Not a very eco-friendly crop.
The Gambia planters soon laid waste to countless acres of land, and when they'd exhausted the soil, they moved on to Johor. There, like locusts, they began their devastation all over again.
You don't hear much about Gambia these days, so presumably the leather industry has found a better alternative. However, Gambia is still used in the preparation of traditional Chinese herbal medicines, so someone out there is growing it somewhere, hopefully in a less environmentally destructive manner.
Many of the departed Gambia planters had originally been located around what was to become Orchard Road, and as the soil slowly recovered its fertility, this cleared land became of interest to a new breed of planters. In the main, canny Scotsmen, they became convinced that the way to get rich quick was to plant nutmeg.
You would have to have tried basic British cooking some 200 years ago to understand why spices from Southeast Asia were so eagerly sought after. Imagine trying to cook a tasty meal for your family with little more than salt at your disposal, and you'll get some idea of what I mean. Southeast Asia was a culinary jewel box, the contents of which were not only delicious, but also extremely profitable. Stamford Raffles recognised this because he had a keen interest in botany as well as in trade. Indeed, it was he who imported the first nutmeg seedlings from Bencoolen in Sumatra. He had hoped to make Singapore the prime supplier of nutmeg to Great Britain, and this noble objective to improve bland British cooking should alone have been enough to have earned him a knighthood. As it happened, he had plenty of other things going for him when it came to being made Sir Stamford Raffles, not least the founding of modern Singapore. It wasn't long before everyone went nutmeg crazy, and one of the most impressive plantations belonged to a Dr. Thomas Oxley, who was Singapore's Surgeon General at the time. And behold, there's his street name. Dr. Oxley's plantation stretched from here on Orchard Road up to River Valley Road and was bounded at one end by Tank Road and at the other end by Grange Road. It was reputed to be the finest nutmeg garden on the island. The area on either side of Orchard Road was one huge nutmeg orchard, hence the undoubted origin of its name, Orchard Road. Plantings and profits rose to dizzy heights and Clearly, anyone who wasn't into nutmeg needed their head read. Until the 1850s, that is. And then a blight struck the imported nutmeg crop, and the plants just withered and died, along with the fortunes of the plantation owners. Many a canny Scotsman who'd bet everything on what they thought was a sure winner retired back to Scotland, cursing to their dying day at the very mention of the word nutmeg.
There were those who hadn't put all their proverbial eggs in one basket and had diversified their crops to include fruit tree orchards. These gentlemen hung on and survived. Others found that a less risky way to turn a profit was to become property developers. They subdivided their estates and built attractive bungalows, which they then either rented or sold.
However, real estate development wasn't quite ready to take over from plantation profits. The latest and greatest cash crop of them all was lurking just over the horizon, unrecognised by all save for a single visionary individual, and his name was Henry Ridley. More of him after the break. I'm reliably informed that over 400,000 motor vehicles regularly use the island's highways and byways. And I have to say that most of them seem to be on Orchard Road today. Now, if one assumes that each vehicle has 4 tyres plus a spare, that makes over 2 million tyres. And that's a hell of a lot of rubber. For those of you who may not be aware of the fact, rubber is manufactured from the sap or latex of a remarkable tree, Havia brasiliensis. And 75 years ago, there were thousands of acres of them, growing in neat little rows all over the island. Rubber plantations were, and still are, an extremely profitable enterprise. And it was here in Singapore that the history of rubber as a commercial crop first began. The rubber tree is a native of Brazil and its neighbours, but sad to say, the story of how rubber came to be planted in Southeast Asia is not half as popular mythology would have us believe. The first seedlings to reach Singapore were not smuggled out of Brazil by some swashbuckling horticultural hero, but came directly from Kew Gardens in England via Ceylon in 1877. As I mentioned earlier, the success of rubber as a commercial plantation crop was largely down to the efforts of one man, Henry Nicholas Ridley, otherwise known as Mad Ridley. Ridley was a man of immense botanical knowledge, and he also had an evangelical enthusiasm for rubber. He received his appointment as director of Singapore's botanical gardens in the same year that Dunlop invented the pneumatic tyre. That was in 1889. Within a couple of years, Ridley had devised the famous herringbone method of incising rubber trees and also demonstrated ways of preparing latex in sheets for the marketplace. Even so, he was still having difficulty in persuading local planters to take up rubber as a crop. One of his stratagems was to slip some seeds into the coat pockets of visiting planters in the hope that when they got back to their plantation, they would find them there and casually throw them over the side of the veranda, and the seeds would germinate naturally of their own accord, thereby proving the viability of rubber as a commercial crop in the Malay Peninsula. That may have been a trifle eccentric, but it was not how he came to be known as Mad Ridley. That story goes as follows. Early on in his career, Ridley was on a plant collecting expedition in the Malay Peninsula in the company of a planter and fellow Briton. And it was raining and they were up to their knees in water and mud. And this occasioned Ridley to make the remark that in South America the natives wore special boots of their own manufacture which kept their feet and legs completely dry. He was referring to indigenous gumboots made by the Indians of Brazil from the latex of rubber trees growing in the wild. Well, his companion thought that obviously Ridley was stark, raving bonkers. And this is how the distinguished botanist came to be known as Mad Ridley.
Planters in Singapore and Malaya had been far more interested in growing coffee than rubber, and Brazil hadn't been entirely pleased with this. To protect her leading position in the coffee industry, she flooded the world markets with an oversupply of coffee beans, effectively forcing local planters out of business. As a result, they became far more amenable to planting rubber trees, and did so at a fortuitous time when world demand for bicycle and car tyres increased dramatically.
So whereas Brazil succeeded in cornering the coffee market, by doing so she inadvertently did local planters an enormous and profitable favour. She persuaded them to swap crops from coffee to rubber, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Between 1905 and 1920, rubber exported from Singapore and Malaya leapt from 400 tonnes per year to a staggering 200,000 tonnes per year. Needless to say, no one was interested in growing coffee anymore.
There was, however, a Peranakan gentleman who was very interested in pineapples, and that's despite the fact that by 1920 he already controlled a sizable portion of Singapore's rubber cultivation. His name was Lim Nee Soon, who cleverly thought of a way to maximise his plantation acres and thereby increase his profits still further.
He planted pineapples between his rubber trees and enjoyed income from them as he patiently waited the 5 or 6 years for his rubber trees to mature and become productive. He became known as the Pineapple King, and Singapore was to remain a major exporter of canned pineapples right up into the 1960s. A modest enterprise by today's standards, as you can see, but profitable nonetheless.
Today, unfortunately, we no longer send our canned pineapples out. Instead, we bring them in. However, to get back to Mr. Lim Nee Soon, in his day, he was such a benefactor to the northern part of the island that the suburb where his factories and plantations were once located now bears his name, Yishun. Singapore isn't in the habit of erecting statues to worthy gentlemen, and more's the pity, but one was erected in his honour, standing proudly amongst the prosperity he helped to create.
Before Mr. Lim's rubber trees and pineapple plants covered the northern reaches of the island, it was coconut plantations that covered Katong and much of the east coast. Indeed, before Geylang lemongrass, or Geylang serai, the area was known as Geylang coconuts, or Geylang kelapa. Whether the crops were coconuts, pineapples, rubber, or even nutmeg, the early agricultural estates held one feature in common: a splendid bungalow for the owners or their managers and families, generally perched on a hilltop, and for the times quite luxuriously appointed. Observe, if you will, this proud couple with their new car, looking rather like Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman in happier days, I might add.
Now this is a really beautiful and unusual house. It's out at Alexandra Park and it's referred to as the Plantation House, which would seem to indicate that it was at once at the centre of an agricultural estate. And the interesting thing is that I've been unable to find any record of it in the National Archives in the working drawings which are lodged there. These were drawings which were submitted to the municipality for planning permission, and they go back to 1884, which would seem to indicate that this house must predate that period. And that, to my mind, makes it one of the oldest houses that is still lived in as a private residence in Singapore. There are a lot of unusual features about this house, not least the L-shaped plan. You can see it going around the corners there. And that was an exceptional sort of idea for the mid or late 19th century, if I'm right in thinking the house is as old as it is. And then there are, underneath the floor, it's supported by wrought iron beams. And that was another strange detail to find in that early period. And there's something else which is also very interesting just around the corner here. Now we're looking at the bedroom wing of the house here, and the interesting feature is this strange chimney-like device, which you can see it coming down. There's a flue there, and if you go underneath the house, there's actually a kind of an affair like a baker's oven. Now, this wasn't the kitchen. The kitchen is detached from the main part of the house like it is in all these 19th century buildings. So all I can think is that this was an early hot water system so that the lord and master of the estate could have a decent hot bath of a morning. Now take a look at this other feature, the raising of the house on brick piers. It allowed the through circulation of air underneath the house, and this ventilated the wooden floors and generally alleviated the humid conditions within the house. And it also safeguarded against attack from termites on an otherwise largely timber structure. and it could be useful in times of flood, which, given Singapore's damp and rainy monsoon climate, were not uncommon. Lastly, it gave protection against snakes and other beasties. Ah, a planter's chair, just the thing for a foot-weary rubber planter after a tiring trudge around his estate.
Davison of the jungle, ever alert and ever watchful, treads a careful path through the undergrowth as he makes his way home, aware that at any moment a tiger might spring out in search of a hearty British breakfast.
I was actually looking for the cat. In the 14 years that I've lived in this house, I've had over 30 cats, and I know for certain that a great number of them have ended up as a python's dinner. And the old python's pretty partial to a bit of poultry now and again. I once woke up to find a 3-metre specimen wrapped around my duck. Well, the old girl survived the ordeal, as you can see, but she never laid an egg again. Getting back to the old tiger, the only big cat that I'm liable to meet these days would be at the zoo. It was a very different story 150 years ago out on the plantations.
It must be said that tigers are magnificent beasts, and far too few of them share the world with us today. However, this wasn't always the case. Hungry tigers regularly swam across from Johore to lunch on wild deer and pigs, of which there were many. But then they began to fancy a bit of Chinese or Indian takeaway.
A rather less lethal tiger, depending of course on how many you drink.
Visiting tigers began to take away unfortunate plantation workers with increasing regularity. So clearly, something had to be done about it.
Back in the 19th century, tigers were scarcely a joking matter, but they were known as the gentlemen in stripes. Perhaps it was considered unlucky to refer to them directly by name. Certainly there were a great number of unfortunates who met their death by a close encounter of the fatal kind with the said gentleman. May they rest in peace. The first death by tiger was recorded in 1831. After that there was a bit of a lull, but from the 1840s onwards, up until around 1890, it is no exaggeration to say that there was at least one person taken by a tiger every single day of the year. Evidently the gentleman in stripes was dining out rather well, and usually at the expense of some poor plantation worker. Indeed, many Gambia and nutmeg plantations had to be abandoned simply because no labourer could be induced to work on them because of the predations by tigers. This obviously had a detrimental effect on their local economy, and the Singapore government and Chamber of Commerce actually offered a bounty for every tiger that was brought in dead or alive. The initial figure was $20, but it eventually arose to $150, so serious was the tiger menace in those days. There were also professional tiger hunters, and they usually were quite colourful characters. I mentioned one in my book here, and if you'll permit me. This is a fellow by the name of Neil Martin Carney, and he was described by a contemporary as a man of roving frame of mind who never settled down to a steady life. For a time he would be the chief clerk of the municipality, then he would become an inspector, and then something else. But the moment he heard of a tiger, his office saw him no more. Tigers may have consumed an awful lot of plantation workers, but in the end it was the plantations which finished off the tigers, simply by removing their natural habitat and their more regular supply of food. By the end of the 19th century, the gentleman in stripes had to look elsewhere for his supper.
Not all tigers got the message that man was off the menu, and this one arrived in Chua Chu Kang in 1928, possibly Singapore's last visit from the gentleman in stripes. So when the tiger menace subsided, the plantation workers returned to their jobs, their only fear now being that they might be made to wear British hats.
As well as the crops we've already mentioned, sago, tapioca, and even that evil weed, tobacco, flourished island-wide during Singapore's agricultural heyday. And when we were still part of the Straits Settlements, this is how the world saw us. In Singapore, this small girl lives. The things that come from there are India rubber, sago rice, and many spices rare. Well, that's rather nice, isn't it?
Clearly, large-scale farming of anything these days is impractical. Land is far too valuable and the financial returns much too small. So of necessity, we must import our produce from neighbouring countries with considerably more land at their disposal. It's a bit sad, but that's modern economics for you. But having said that, you can still buy some locally grown fruit and veg in Singapore if you know where to find it. And I'll show you where just after we take a quick look at what we're up to next week.
We've had Davison of the river, Davison of the jungle, and now it's Davison of the sea, where ships of war and traders more whips back into the island's maritime past and hurtles up for a bird's eye view of where millions of ships have dropped anchor. Some Bawang shipyards might be off limits, but there are no limits as to where our man with the hat will go, providing he's not arrested, of course. And what about that mysterious tower on Mount Faber? Next week on Sight and Sound.
The days when Singapore as an island was agriculturally self-sufficient may long be over. But out here at Sungai Tengah, it's still possible to find the occasional vegetable farm. In this instance, catering to the growing demand for organic produce in Singapore. And you know, looking around, it really reminds me of the market gardens that used to be on either side of Bradle Road when I was a child. It's very nice. I, for one, would like to see this link with Singapore's historical past maintained. But more to the point, I'm reliably informed by my friends here at Green Circle Eco Farm that I'm in for a tasty treat. So until next week, goodbye and bon appetit. So let's take a what am I doing now? The lights are boiling my brain. Ah, lama. And fast, sways. And then a blight struck the imported nutmeg. Sorry, I just can't remember a bloody thing today.